Hello and welcome to the 2.8 syllabus point for this IB biology course. Cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is defined by the controlled release of energy from organic compounds within cells. Now we know that our typical cellular respiration undergoes this equation. We can note that typically our glucose is used. However, we can also see the use of things like lipids and proteins. Generally speaking, lipids and proteins are for that longer term storage, whilst your things like sugars are more short term, so things like glucose, for instance. So we can note in this equation we have glucose, oxygen, producing carbon dioxide and water. Most notably, and perhaps most importantly, is that production of ATP, so adenosine triphosphate, which is that energy that we require for that cellular function. So looking at ATP specifically, we know it's 3 covalently bonded phosphate groups as a general simplification, and effectively the breaking of these particular bonds causes us to get that energy. So we know that the energy is stored there. So when a bond is removed, energy is released. We can see here in the instance where ATP is produced to ADP, so adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate. If we look at the particular words, we know that this is effectively just going to symbolize 2. So for ADP, we know that effectively one of those 3 phosphates has been removed, and that of course releases that energy. So in getting ATP in the first place, we can actually get it from ADP as well. So it's effectively where a phosphate group is added such that we can get that third group in that structure. So this is typically seen from that energy from organic molecules as such. In things like glycolysis, which I'll mention fairly briefly, are the breakdown of glucose into pyruvate, which is effectively your smaller carbon compounds. So we know that glucose breaks down into 2 of those 3 carbon compounds. Now, similarly, the energy from this bond breaking forms ATP. We know that 2 ATP molecules are needed for the reaction to take place, but 4 are produced. So when looking at your production of ATP, it can actually be from, as mentioned, those organic molecules, which is effectively seen in things like glycolysis. Looking at this diagram of glycolysis, we can see that we start off with glucose, so a 6 carbon structure. We have an input of those 2 ATP molecules to, as it says, get the reaction started. Following that, we have the glucose being broken down into 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules, which in turn produces 4 total ATP molecules. So we've used 2 to get the reaction started, and we've produced 4, so therefore we have that net gain of 2 molecules, which allows that energy to be used accordingly. The first notable type of respiration is that of anaerobic respiration. What's most notable about this form is that it proceeds in the absence of that oxygen. We know in anaerobic respiration we produce ATP, however, there are also the consequences of lactic acid being produced in animals, along with ethanol and carbon dioxide in plants. Now, this pyruvate effectively allows stocks of NADH to be restored. Now, NADH effectively carries hydrogen ions and electrons between reactions, ultimately allowing that glycolysis to take place, which allows the continuation for that production of ATP. So, anaerobic respiration allows us to still get energy despite having that lack of oxygen. It's important to note as well that this reaction is reversible. So, for instance, if we have lactic acid, we can ultimately convert that back into pyruvate at a later stage when the body, so for humans, for instance, are switching back from that anaerobic back to aerobic, which I'll mention shortly. So as I mentioned, oxygen present allows the conversion of that back into pyruvate. Additionally, we know it occurs in the cytoplasm. So in any particular cell, that's where anaerobic respiration will take place. So we know the uses of anaerobic respiration are as follows, particularly in that low oxygen environment. I'll give an example for humans. In the instance where we'll relate this to fitness. So, we know as the body works to its maximum potential, it exceeds that level of oxygen. So the heart being that main supply and the lungs to supply that oxygenated blood throughout the body. So as that is exceeded beyond its maximum capacity, anaerobic respiration kicks in to meet that demand. Although it is not the most efficient in terms of its production of ATP, producing a net total of 2 ATP molecules, it is very quickly, in essence, therefore making it efficient because during times of fitness, for instance, we want that quick and efficient, fast way to get that energy. So short, intense exercise is that example. Now, lactic acid formation, specifically speaking for animals, leads to muscle fatigue. So lactic acid is something which effectively it's fairly well known to cause muscle strain and fatigue. So after doing strenuous exercise, you may notice that like your muscles are sore, and that's due to that buildup of that lactic acid as a consequence of your body undergoing that anaerobic respiration. Now we know that less ATP is produced than aerobic, and as we mentioned, anaerobic respiration is more about the speed as opposed to the amount of ATP produced. So it's that balance between when it's needed for speed and when it's needed in that large quantity, considering there are only 2 molecules produced. Now looking at aerobic respiration, much more molecules of ATP produced, 36 in fact per glucose molecule. So quite a step up from your 2 molecules of ATP. We know that ATP is produced in turn with carbon dioxide and water, and unlike anaerobic respiration in the cytoplasm, it occurs in the mitochondria for eukaryotic cells. So that's important to note because, of course, prokaryotes don't have that same compartmentalized structure. So you'll find for prokaryotes, it will effectively just be in that cytoplasm. Prokaryotes. Now, aerobic respiration requires oxygen. So you can imagine that for the most part in humans, we use aerobic respiration, except for that time when our body requires more than what can be met for this aerobic respiration. So briefly speaking, we know aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria, as I said, and in the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle occurs, which is effectively, as a simplification, a series of chemical reactions to gain more ATP via that oxidization. So ultimately we're left with no oxygen left in the Krebs cycle, allowing for that additional energy to be sourced, totaling up at that 36 molecule count per molecule of glucose. So as a comparison overall, we can note the differences in place. So cytoplasm for your anaerobic and mitochondria for your aerobic both use glucose. For our anaerobic, we know the products are your lactic acid, which just symbolizes that, and then your plants and CO2. We know for anaerobic it's 2 ATP molecules, whilst aerobic up to 30. With, of course, that requirement of O2, accordingly, oxygen. So that's the end of this 2.8 syllabus point, being cellular respiration. Thank you for watching.